In this video, we're going to explore an intriguing story of three American friends, their unexpected journey from simple travelers to drug smugglers and escapees from one of the worst prisons in the country. We'll uncover the details of their story, every turn on their path to getting involved with the drugs in the first place, and then changing the course of their lives forever by getting into and then out of the darkest and most horrible prisons in Mexico. The story begins in 1972 with three friends from the U.S. Mike Cook, May Stanley, and Paul Smith traveling from the U.S. to Mexico on a boat, specifically from California to the coast of Mexico, the city called Mazatlan. At that time, the security on shore borders wasn't very strict because no one anticipated visitors on boats amid open ocean waters, so Americans could freely travel in and out of Mexico that way. The only thing that was definitely in place is the Coast Guard Agency for combating one of the most pervasive problems, then and now, drug trafficking, both on water and on land. Little did they know that this information will be important for them in the near future. They managed to travel all this distance in search for a perfect place to surf, relax, and have an adventure, without any hindrances like ocean patrols and so on. But after almost reaching the Mexican land, their boat's engine began breaking down. They bought the boat very cheaply several weeks ago and naively thought that it would work out. It clearly didn't. Their original plan was to travel to another country and spend all their free summertime on an amazing sea adventure, discovering new interesting places, relaxing and having fun. They began thinking what they could do to fix the engine. Unfortunately, they had only about $300, which wasn't enough to properly fix the boat, and even if they would have fixed it, they would have no money left for further travel. Then one of them suggested, what if we could earn some money? They liked the idea, but what could they possibly do? On their travel trip, they took some weed, which they all were using, and also they managed to buy some more when they went into the city and got into a taxi. The driver offered the lost foreigners to buy some from him. They were glad that it was much cheaper than in the US, and it wasn't very long after that they realized what they could do. They began thinking through, what if we could earn the money by buying and then selling the weed ourselves and then fix the boat? They all agreed on the arrangement. To start, they found the taxi driver to buy more from him. He then happily drove them out of town to a spot where dealers were operating, as far from the civilization as possible in the middle of desert. They came out of the car, nervous, not knowing what to expect, and after some time they saw a man on a donkey approaching them. They noticed that the donkey carried bags full of weed. They were shocked at the amount, since they have never seen anything like this before. Unfortunately, they hadn't specified how much they intended to buy. Since they had only $300, they wouldn't be able to buy everything. It was clearly a miscommunication, since even the driver didn't speak English fluently and thought that they wanted to buy a substantial amount. There was no other options. They pulled out their money and said it was all they had. The delivery man and the taxi driver got angry and began arguing with them. They clearly expected more. With everyone trying to speak in their own language, the argument was going nowhere. So they finally decided to resolve the issue. The friends gave their last money, and the taxi driver exchanged it for all the weed, which amounted to 6 full bags. The driver was furious, since he expected much more from them, so he drove them to the closest edge of the city and dropped them there. They asked him to take him to the coast, but he refused, since the city inside was full of cops, and they had 6 bags of weed, so he wouldn't take that risk upon himself. They needed to go on their own. They anxiously proceeded to walk on their own, carrying full bags of drugs with them. Suddenly, they noticed a police officer standing about 20 meters from them. They thought that now they're done, especially because they also stood out from the rest of the people, being clearly white Americans. But they continued walking forward by the edge of the city, trying not to draw any unnecessary attention, and finally got to the coast with no problems. Once they got to their boat, they began thinking where they could hide all 20 pounds of weed. One of them suggested, what if we hide it inside the surfing boards? They thought it was a decent idea, and so they proceeded to do it. They opened the boards, stuffed them with tightly packed weed, and used tools to realistically close them again. They did a great job. No one would have suspected anything just by looking. Unfortunately, the engine broke down completely by that time, and so the boat wouldn't start. They couldn't believe it. Now there was only one option left, to go back and find someone who could help them. They came out of the boat and went looking for someone. That's when they met 2 brothers, Frank and Dan Sayre, who were also Americans like them. So they quickly recognized each other and found a common ground. After some friendly talking, the trio said that they had a boat, but the engine broke down and they couldn't get back to the US. As if by luck, the The two brothers said that they were just planning on going back on their boat and even invited them to go together if they wanted to. Mike, Mace, and Paul could only dream about such a coincidence and were extremely happy with the offer, so they agreed. That's exactly what they needed. They needed to prepare and take their things, and by the next morning, already sailing back to the US. They planned to go back, sell all the weed, and for the earned money buy a newer, bigger and better boat this time, since now they would be rich. On the next morning, they were all preparing to sail. The trio was excited because now they could return to the US and safely keep their secret. But they didn't know that the two brothers had a secret of their own, a much larger secret. They got going and soon began talking and having fun together. Later, one of the brothers even offered everyone some weed to relax even more, which they all began using. Well, after a while, everyone was high, but especially the two brothers. And so one of them started telling who they really were and what they were doing. The two brothers were actually professional drug smugglers. The boat they were on was loaded with an enormous amount of weed, 2,200 pounds of pure product, which they bought from dealers in Mexico for $30,000 and intended to smuggle it into America and then sell it for 10 times that price, $300,000. Today, that would be around $2 million. The two brothers offered Mike, Mace, and Paul a deal to pay them for their assistance in the operation of delivering the weed to their place in the US, $10,000 each. The trio definitely hasn't expected anything like this, and was even considering whether it is worth it at all, since they only planned to sell their small amount and go traveling without much effort. If they accepted the offer, the risk of getting caught and imprisoned for being serious drug smugglers would be substantial, but also they could have a chance to earn even more money, get rich and afford a truly luxurious life. The three friends discussed the question and eventually decided to accept the offer, regardless of any risks. Now they were all in one group. The journey to the US would take about a week on the water, while also trying to follow verified, safe routes to successfully deliver the product to the final destination. For quite some time they were moving with no problems, when suddenly the boat hit something in the water. They were all thrown from their places, and all the weed packs were also thrown around. It seems that whatever was in the water made a hole in the boat, and water began coming inside, sinking the boat and everyone on it. Everyone ran for their lives to get out of the boat before it sank completely. After the chaotic accident, they were all in the ocean water, in the middle of nowhere, at night, and couldn't see almost anything. For several hours, violent waves carried them in an unknown direction, which they couldn't resist against. They believed that now they're destined to drown. But soon they started to hear water hitting a solid surface. They looked around and saw the very shore they came from. The waves brought them back where they started. After several hours of struggling against severe waves, they were exhausted, and upon reaching the beach, they fell down and slept until the next morning. After waking up, they were immediately struck by what they saw around. The storm brought back not only them, but also almost all the weed. The whole beach was covered with the weed packs. If anyone noticed them with all this weed, they would be arrested on the spot. So they quickly began digging holes and trying to throw all the packs inside. They were trying their best, but still couldn't finish the job. So they ran towards a road nearby and met some villagers there. They asked if they could help them to get to the nearest city, because they were foreigners and their boat had sunk. The villagers reluctantly agreed and began moving on a truck to the closest city. The five thought that now they're safe. They successfully covered their tracks and no one would find them. Unfortunately, they haven't noticed several spying security agents on the shore, which followed them all this time. After some time, the truck was stopped at a large block post in the middle of the road with many police officers, pointing their guns and yelling, "Get out of the car and surrender." Now they were caught. The police delivered all five to the station, where all of them were officially charged with possession and distribution of drugs in large amounts, and sent to one of the filthiest and most dangerous prisons in the country. They were thrown inside like animals, and were completely shocked at what they saw. The prison was like a human zoo. It was full of inmates who were literally on top of each other. It was a total mess. Literally hundreds of them were staring at the newcomers. There were entire mobs of them. Some of them were taking drugs right in front of the guards, because the guards didn't care at all what would happen to them. The prisoners here were from the darkest, the most desperate bottom of the civilization. The five American friends were devastated on not knowing what would happen next, and how they're going to survive in this ditch of a place. They didn't even know for how long they were going to be there. This was an absolute disaster. They looked at each other and immediately realized they were thinking about the same thing. We have to escape. On the next morning of their imprisonment, they woke up and began discreetly observing every detail of the prison they could. There were 2 large walls surrounding the prison, a 25-foot tall one and an 8-foot tall one with sharp glass on top with additional barbed wiring throughout the perimeter. So it would be impossible to escape that way. The only option left is to dig a tunnel through the ground. It sounded easy at first, but the problem was that they were walking on a concrete floor, which significantly complicated the situation even further. Fortunately, as Americans, they all have seen The Great Escape, a movie based on a true story, which had very useful and practical scenes about how to escape from a prison, as shown by 76 prisoners escaping Nazi prison during the World War II through an underground tunnel. They needed to go through a lot of obstacles to finally get free, break through the concrete floor under their cell and start making a tunnel, which had to pass under the bathrooms to reach the water pipes, which came out of the prison. The estimated length of the tunnel needed to be about 30 to 50 feet. First, to break the concrete, they definitely needed some tools, like a hammer and a big screwdriver. Luckily, Mike noticed that there was some prison work going on near one of the large walls, so there were large stones just lying there. He secretly went there and took one of the stones. Now they had something for a hammer. But what about a screwdriver? One of the 5 became acquainted with some inmates and managed to buy from one of them a blunt butter knife. At least now they had something to begin the work. They started close to one of the walls, underneath the beds, which would be the nearest path to the outside. Additionally, they set up a small tent out of a blanket around the digging place to muffle the sound, and organized a lookout system. Now they were prepared to begin. They started breaking the floor piece by piece. There was always someone inside the cell to tell if the noise of breaking was too loud. They would need to wait until the noise from the prison was sufficient to cover the sound of breaking. They planned on breaking the cement in a rectangular shape to take it out in one piece. The problem was that the guards would be able to see easily what they were doing if they saw the crack. So the group put dust and dirt into the crack every day to make it practically invisible. They worked slowly but surely, week by week, breaking the concrete, until finally they did it. They could now easily remove this piece of the floor and proceed forward. They were euphoric and couldn't believe their own eyes. After they removed the concrete lid, they saw that the ground was wet. They didn't think much about it at first and started digging. But the water just kept coming back up. So they came up with an idea to use buckets in the cell to try to take out the water into the toilet. They tried for almost 3 whole days, but the water kept coming back to the same level as before. They were exhausted and devastated, thinking what they were going to do next. They thought that the entire plan was completely ruined. For the next 5 months, they were spending their time trying to accept the fact that they're going to be trapped here for the rest of their lives. Until one day there was news about a breakage of one of the major water pipes, which stopped all water supply to the prison. They immediately thought about their tunnel hole. It was completely dry, so they started digging right away. The size of the hole was as wide as their shoulders. They were making a fast progress, and after making it deep enough, they would lie on their stomach and continue digging forward towards the wall. The soil quickly began piling up. They didn't know where to put it, so they started putting some amount into toilets and the rest under their beds. They worked hard digging the tunnel several feet farther and farther each day, digging for up to 8 hours in shifts. Well, the progress was steady and smooth, when unexpectedly Paul came out of the hole, pale as a sheet. He accidentally broke one of the main underground sewer pipes. They were completely shocked. The tunnel in several hours filled with water and raw waste from all the prison toilets. It was a real catastrophe for them. They definitely couldn't continue the digging. Someone had to swim there and fix the pipe. No one would go, so they decided to talk to another American in prison. His name was Banny. He was a drug addict from New York, and so they thought they could persuade him to do it. At first, he completely refused, understandably. But then the group made him an ultimate offer. If he helped them, they would escape together, and then give him enough money to start living a new life. After some thinking, he agreed on the deal. They made a repair kit consisting of a coffee can with cement patch that they have made, so he swam inside and successfully fixed the pipe. They could finally continue digging. They kept digging and digging towards the outer wall. They decided to check where they were, so they made a small hole at the top of the tunnel to see the surface. They saw the light right above them, so they knew that the wall was very close. Just several more feet and they're free. One of the two brothers they met in the beginning, Dan, lived and worked in Mexico for several years, so he had money and connection. That means that as soon as they escape, they will have all the necessary resources to get home. One night later, at the dusk, they decided to make the final move and go till the end, together. They brilliantly decided to put on their clothes inside out, to then change it on the clean side upon escaping, so that no one will be suspicious of them. They all laid down head to foot and proceeded to go through the tunnel. Well, they finally got out, and after moments of excitement, they walked near the wall, one after another. Now it's the final part, to go from there, across the street in full view of the guards, without attracting their attention. One mistake and they're back in the prison. They changed their clothes to the clean side and calmly went across the street like nothing has happened, chatting and doing their thing. After crossing the street and turning behind a corner, they finally ran. They were later met by the people of Dan and Frank and then successfully driven away. Mike, Mace, and Paul headed for the U.S. border at El Paso, Texas. Fortunately, Dan's people had 3 friends' passports with them on their boat, so at the border the trio showed their documents and were allowed to go in with no questions. This was a truly nerve-wracking and unbelievable story of 3 traveling friends and their adventure, consisting of getting caught and imprisoned in another country, and then beating all the odds by successfully escaping from it through sheer willpower, determination, and cooperation. If you've enjoyed watching this video, don't forget to support the channel by liking and subscribing. If you have any questions or suggestions, leave them in the comments below. See you in the next one.